There is a certain kind of introduction that changes the temperature of a room without anyone raising their voice. I did not understand that until the evening my husband brought another woman into my home and called her his friend. Nothing broke, nothing shattered, but something shifted. My name is Loretta Mayfield. I was 68 years old that spring, living in Columbus, Georgia, in the brick house my husband and I had paid for over 37 careful years. I had believed that if you tended a home long enough, it would learn your heartbeat and protect it. I had always understood my place in the family as the steady one. I was the keeper of birthdays, the folder of laundry, the listener when tempers cooled. My husband, Raymond, had been the provider in his own quiet way. We were not loud people. We endured. Love, to me, had always looked like staying. It looked like shared bills, shared burdens, shared silence at the end of a long day. Loyalty was not something we spoke about. It was something we practiced in small, daily sacrifices that no one applauded. That afternoon, Raymond said he was bringing someone by to discuss a church committee matter. He did not look at me when he said it. I remember the way he adjusted his cufflinks twice. I remember thinking he had begun to fidget more lately. I set out the good glasses anyway. Habit is stronger than suspicion. I placed the lemon slices just right in the pitcher. I wiped the table even though it was already clean. A woman prepares her home as if preparation itself can guard her. When the doorbell rang, I felt a small hesitation in my chest. It was not fear. It was something quieter, like the pause before rain. Raymond walked ahead of me to open the door, as though he needed to arrive there first. She stepped inside, wearing a soft blue dress and a smile that lingered too long. Raymond introduced her as Vanessa, a friend from the community outreach program. He said the word friend with a gentleness I had not heard directed toward me in years. I extended my hand and welcomed her in. My voice did not tremble. I had been raised not to let strangers measure my feelings. Still, I noticed how Raymond stood slightly closer to her than the doorway required, as though proximity had become instinct. We sat in the living room I had arranged decades earlier. The same curtains, the same framed wedding photo above the mantel. Vanessa's eyes moved across the room carefully, studying not just the furniture, but the history embedded in it. Raymond spoke more than usual. He explained small details about our house that he had never thought important before. He told her about the oak tree we planted the year our son left for college. I watched him narrate our life like a tour guide. Vanessa laughed at his jokes. They were not new jokes. I had heard them years, but she laughed as if they were discoveries. I felt no immediate anger. I felt something stranger, as if I had been moved slightly out of frame. The visit lasted an hour. They spoke of meetings and plans and charity events, nothing improper, nothing that could be held up as evidence. And yet the air between them carried a familiarity that did not match the timeline I had been given. When she rose to leave, she touched Raymond lightly on the forearm. It was a brief touch, polite even, but I had been his wife long enough to recognize the difference between courtesy and comfort. Comfort has memory in it. After the door closed, the house did not return to its former shape. Raymond busied himself stacking plates that did not need stacking. I asked if the committee had set a date for their next meeting. He answered, but he did not look at me. That was the evening I realized introductions are not always about welcoming someone new. Sometimes they are about preparing you for a truth that has already taken root. I did not know the full story yet, but I felt the ground beneath me loosen. I have always believed that a woman knows when something in her home has shifted, even if she cannot yet name it. The walls do not speak, but they carry vibrations. After Vanessa's visit, the house felt aware of something I was still trying to understand. Raymond began mentioning her casually, as though repetition would make her presence ordinary. He spoke of her efficiency with paperwork, her dedication to community service, her thoughtful ideas during meetings. Each compliment was delivered lightly, almost rehearsed. I listened without interruption. I had learned early in marriage that silence can gather more truth than questions. When a person feels unchallenged, they reveal themselves in the spaces they believe are safe. I allowed those spaces to widen. In the evenings, Raymond started lingering on his phone longer than usual. He angled the screen slightly away from me, not dramatically, just enough. The gesture was subtle, but in a long marriage, subtle becomes visible. I told myself that suspicion is a restless companion. I had seen friends ruin their peace chasing fears that turned out to be shadows. So I folded laundry, cooked dinner, and kept my observations to myself. Patience had carried me through many storms before. Still, I began noticing small adjustments in him. He changed his cologne. He pressed his shirts more carefully before certain meetings. He hummed in the kitchen one afternoon, a soft tune I had not heard him hum since our early years. I did not confront him, not because I was afraid, but because I needed clarity more than conflict. Accusations without certainty can bruise a marriage beyond repair. I wanted to know what I was standing on before I chose my next step. Our son called one evening, asking about the church anniversary plans. I almost mentioned Vanessa, then decided against it. There are burdens children should not carry, even grown ones. A mother protects where she can. The second time Vanessa came over, Raymond informed me only an hour beforehand. He said they needed to review some documents. His tone carried an expectation that I would accommodate without question. I did. This time she brought a pie. She handed it to me with warmth, complimenting my home as if it were a shared achievement. I thanked her. My smile remained steady. I noticed she no longer scanned the room. She moved through it with comfort. They sat at the dining table, reviewing papers. I remained nearby, not hovering, simply present. Their conversation flowed easily. They referenced moments from previous meetings that I had never heard about. Time had passed somewhere beyond my awareness. At one point, Raymond looked at her with an expression I had once recognized as admiration. It was not lust. It was not obvious flirtation. It was something softer, more dangerous. It was appreciation wrapped in newness. I remembered how he used to look at me when I spoke passionately about starting my catering business. That memory did not wound me sharply. It settled like a quiet ache beneath my ribs. Later that night, I asked Raymond how long he had known Vanessa. He paused only briefly before answering. "A few months," he said. The pause was small, but it existed. In marriage, even a breath can hold meaning. I lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. I wondered when companionship becomes something else. Not overnight, not with fireworks, but slowly, through shared tasks and repeated laughter. I did not cry. Tears require certainty. I was still gathering pieces. but I began to understand that whatever this was, it had not begun the day she stepped into my home. It had begun quietly, somewhere I had not been invited. And for the first time in many years, I felt like a guest in my own marriage, watching my husband introduce a version of himself I no longer fully recognized.
The third time Vanessa came to my house, she did not bring pie. She brought a folder and a confidence that suggested she had been there many times before. Raymond opened the door before I could rise from my chair, as though he had been waiting. I was in the kitchen shelling peas when they walked in. The soft rhythm of peas hitting the bowl steadied my hands. Vanessa greeted me by name, her voice warm, practiced. I noticed she no longer waited for Raymond to guide her inside. She walked toward the dining room without asking where to sit. That small familiarity pressed against my chest more firmly than any dramatic gesture could have. A woman learns the shape of another woman's comfort quickly. It reveals history. Raymond asked if we had more of that sweet tea from last time. The way he said last time told me there had been other moments I had not witnessed, moments that had built a quiet foundation between them. I placed the pitcher on the table and sat across from him. They were discussing a fundraiser, something about sponsorship letters and outreach calls. It was all ordinary, respectable work, nothing anyone could call improper. But as they leaned over the papers, their shoulders nearly touching, I noticed how easily they coordinated. He would begin a thought and she would complete it. That kind of rhythm takes time. It does not grow from 3 brief meetings. I remembered when Raymond and I used to move like that in the kitchen, passing each other without collision, finishing sentences without effort. Shared years had once woven us into that same ease. Now I felt like an observer of it. Vanessa asked me how long Raymond and I had been married. Her question was gentle, but it carried curiosity. I answered plainly, 37 years. I watched her face for reaction. She smiled respectfully, though something flickered behind her eyes. Raymond cleared his throat and said, "Time goes by faster than you think." He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at her, as if time was something they were both newly aware of. After they left, I washed the glasses slowly. I let the water run longer than necessary. I was not angry. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was displacement, as though my history was being gently edged aside to make room. That night I walked through each room of my house. I touched the back of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the quilt my mother stitched before she passed. I needed to remind myself that I belonged here. I thought about the early years of my marriage, the long shifts Raymond worked, the nights I stayed up balancing bills, the way we celebrated small victories like they were grand achievements. We had built this life carefully. It unsettled me that something so carefully built could be unsettled without raised voices, no slammed doors, no obvious betrayal, just the quiet arrival of another presence becoming familiar. I chose not to accuse him. Not yet. I needed to know whether this was a passing attachment or something rooted deeper. Sometimes confrontation forces people to retreat without revealing the truth. I wanted truth more than apology. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa's name appeared more often in conversation. Raymond mentioned her opinions, her schedule, her availability. He began comparing her efficiency to that of others in the committee. The comparisons were subtle but consistent. I noticed he did not compare her to me. That omission spoke louder than any contrast would have. He kept those two worlds separate, as though protecting them from collision. One evening I asked if the committee planned to host meetings elsewhere. He hesitated before answering that sometimes it was easier at our house. Easier. The word lingered. Easier for whom? I nodded and said nothing more, but I understood that ease can be dangerous. It can make inappropriate closeness feel justified, even necessary. And I could feel that ease settling into my house like furniture I had not chosen. The first time I saw Raymond smile at a message he would not share, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me. It was not shock, it was confirmation, the kind that arrives quietly and does not leave. We were sitting on opposite ends of the sofa. The television played low, more background than focus. His phone lit up. He glanced at it and a small smile formed. Not wide, not dramatic, just intimate. I did not ask who it was. I did not lean over to look. A woman of my age learns that chasing proof rarely brings peace. Instead, I watched his expression fade as he typed a reply. He turned the phone face down afterward. Later that week, he mentioned that Vanessa might need a ride to a community event. Her car was in the shop, he said. The explanation came quickly, prepared. I offered to go along. He responded that it might be a long evening. The implication was clear. He preferred I stay home. I agreed without resistance. Sometimes agreement exposes more than protest. When he left, dressed carefully in a navy blazer he had not worn in years, I stood at the window. I did not watch for drama. I simply observed how promptly he drove away. No hesitation, no backward glance at the house. I had once been the reason he lingered at doorways. That memory surfaced softly. While he was gone, I sat at the dining table alone, the same table where Vanessa had leaned forward discussing letters and donors. I ran my fingers across its surface and tried to locate the moment things began to tilt. When Raymond returned that night, he smelled faintly of a perfume that was not mine. It was subtle, almost polite. I had worn the same scent for decades. I knew the difference between mine and someone else's presence. He spoke about the event in general terms. Good turnout, successful pledges. Vanessa did an excellent job coordinating volunteers. He mentioned her name twice more than necessary. Each time his tone carried quiet admiration. I asked if she got home safely. He answered yes, quickly, too quickly. The answer had been ready before the question finished forming. That readiness felt practiced. Days passed in this rhythm. His schedule expanded, meetings extended. My world remained steady, but his seemed to be branching outward in directions that did not include me. One afternoon, I found myself remembering my mother's words. She used to say that a marriage does not break suddenly. It thins, like fabric worn too often in the same place. I began to consider whether our fabric had been thinning long before Vanessa appeared. Had I mistaken routine for stability? Had we been coexisting instead of connecting? There is a difference between companionship and convenience. I had always believed we were companions. Now I wondered if we had quietly become convenient to one another. The shift did not feel explosive. It felt gradual, almost respectful, as if he was stepping away 1 inch at a time, hoping I would not notice the distance widening. I started waking up earlier in the mornings. I would sit at the kitchen table before sunrise, listening to the house breathe. In that early stillness, I allowed myself to acknowledge what daylight encouraged me to minimize. I was no longer certain that the word friend accurately described the woman who moved so easily through my home and my husband's thoughts. But certainty, I knew, was coming, and I could feel it approaching, not with noise, but with clarity. I began keeping track of time differently, not in
Hours, not in minutes, but in visits and gestures. Each encounter with Vanessa added a fraction to the story I was slowly reading. I did not need proof. I needed the pattern. It reveals itself eventually in its own quiet way. I started noticing how Raymond's tone softened when he spoke about her. Not just politeness, not just affection, something heavier than admiration, something subtle enough that only a long-time observer would feel the change. It was almost imperceptible to anyone else. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I heard laughter in the dining room. It was not boisterous. It was calm, easy. I paused. I recognized it immediately. That laughter had once been reserved for our kitchen. Now it lived somewhere else, in a different frame. I did not interrupt. I did not linger. I let them have their space, even though the air carried a heaviness I could not shake. The house seemed smaller when they were together. Rooms that once contained us both comfortably now felt like corridors between two worlds. I remembered my father's hands, strong and steady. He never shouted, never forced authority. He let consequences unfold naturally. I felt his presence in me that day, reminding me that patience is not passive. It gathers strength quietly, like water wearing stone. That night, I poured a cup of tea and sat in my chair by the window. The house was still. Raymond was upstairs. I wondered when a person begins to belong somewhere that is not home. I wondered how easily hearts travel without leaving a footprint. I began speaking less and observing more. I noticed how Raymond's eyes lingered on her photographs from events. I noticed how he praised her efficiency to others, casually, as if she were a benchmark he had discovered only recently. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet attention that accumulates weight over time. I knew this because I had given him the same attention for years. I knew exactly what it looked like when it was for me, and I recognized now that it had shifted. I did not confront. I did not ask questions that would only elicit rehearsed answers. I waited, as I always had, for moments to arrive in their own natural order. Truth, like rain, will eventually fall. All one can do is stand quietly and feel it. One evening, Vanessa left her folder behind. Raymond told me he would return it the next day. I held the folder in my hands longer than necessary. It smelled faintly of her perfume. Familiarity carries scent as memory carries weight. I returned it silently, without remark. I began writing things down, notes of observation, small details that mattered. How he smiled when she spoke, how he answered her messages promptly, how he lingered near her coat when she said goodbye. All small, but all forming a map. My nights became longer, quieter. I replayed moments in my head, not to punish, but to understand. Betrayal, I discovered, does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it grows in the spaces left by ordinary actions. I thought about the son, our only child. How would he see this? Would he notice, or would he accept the arrangement silently, as adults often do? I resolved to keep my own dignity intact, whatever the outcome. One evening I took a walk around the yard. The oak tree we planted years ago rustled in the wind. It reminded me that growth occurs slowly. that roots run deep even when branches bend in unexpected directions. I inhaled the air deeply, steadying my mind. I understood finally that this was not about confrontation. It was about recognition. Recognition that life, even in its most familiar forms, can shift without warning. And sometimes the only response that preserves dignity is quiet, measured acknowledgement. The following week, Vanessa arrived with a report Raymond had requested. She carried it easily, smiling politely as if the house belonged equally to all of them. I noticed how Raymond's shoulders relaxed when she entered, how his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. That ease had once been mine. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes as they reviewed numbers and letters. Their conversation was civil, professional even, yet the rhythm of it was unmistakable. They had developed a shared cadence, one that I had not been invited to join. It was a strange sensation, watching from the periphery. I had spent decades observing Raymond, reading his moods, predicting his thoughts. Now I realized that some of what I'd known belonged to a time before this woman existed. I remembered when we first built the dining room table, sanding it ourselves. Every mark, every imperfection was ours together. And now another presence moved across that same surface as if it carried history equal to ours. The way Raymond laughed with her was gentle, not loud. It was measured and soft, like a candle flickering in a quiet room. I did not feel anger. I felt an ache, loss of illusion, the realization that someone else could occupy a space I had long held sacred. I thought about my own friends, my own boundaries. When do you step in, and when do you let a situation unfold to see its natural shape? I had learned over decades that patience often reveals truths more plainly than confrontation. That night I wrote in my journal, not complaints, not recriminations, just observations, names, dates, small gestures. I wanted clarity before decision. A mind organized by fact remains unharmed by rumor. I began noticing patterns in Raymond's schedule. Meetings extended, messages answered immediately. He lingered longer on calls. Small things, almost unremarkable, but each a thread that when woven together formed a tapestry I could not ignore. I did not ask Vanessa's intentions. I did not demand explanations. I waited. Observation is patient. It does not rush. It does not betray its own process. I knew that clarity was approaching, slowly, with inevitability. I thought about my own reflection in the mirror. I still saw a woman capable, grounded, capable of measured response. No one had stolen my dignity. No one had taken the calm accumulation of decades. That belonged entirely to me. I considered what patience had taught me, that truth, like water, finds its path regardless of resistance, that sometimes the most powerful action is restraint. I would not move until I understood fully what had shifted beneath my roof. Raymond's eyes began to change when he spoke to me, not dramatically, not with confession, simply an ease that had once been reserved for me. Recognition of it felt like the slow turning of a lock. I knew the door had been opening. I noticed myself checking the calendar, the clock, not for hurry, but for patterns. Days with her visits, nights of quiet reflection, moments when he seemed lighter. Observation is not passive, it is preparation. One morning I brewed coffee and sat at the window before sunrise. The house was quiet, the air still. I watched the trees, felt the temperature change, and allowed myself to acknowledge what had been quietly taking shape. It was no longer necessary to ask questions aloud. The answers were visible in gestures, in glances, in the subtle shape of ordinary days rearranging themselves around someone else. I had witnessed the unfolding. When he arrived that evening, I greeted him with calm familiarity. No accusation, no demand, just presence. I had learned that some truths require witnessing more than voicing, and I had been watching patiently for weeks. I realized then that the measure of this story was not in drama, not in confrontation, but in recognition, and recognition, fully felt, carries its own quiet weight.
The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm I could not ignore. Vanessa's presence became part of the background of our lives, like a tune that plays softly but refuses to fade. Raymond mentioned her often, casually, without seeming to notice the way I heard it differently. I watched him from the kitchen doorway one evening, his back to me, as they reviewed schedules and events. The tilt of his head, the ease in his posture, it was intimate in a way that no one else would notice but me. I did. I remembered our early years, when every glance and gesture was ours alone. We had grown into familiarity, yes, but it had been shared, deliberate. Now, familiarity was no longer mine to claim entirely. It belonged, in part, to her. I did not speak. I did not interrupt. I had learned that speaking before understanding creates ripples that cannot be controlled. Silence, I discovered, can be the most powerful witness to unfolding truth. One evening, he left for an event with her. He asked me if I wanted to go along. I said no. My refusal was quiet, simple, but firm. I did not need to justify it. I had chosen to observe rather than participate. That night, I sat by the window in the dark, watching the house breathe in his absence. The walls were quiet, but they remembered. They remembered his attention, his laughter, and the subtle shifts that came with each visit. I thought about the small betrayals that accumulate over time, not loud, not dramatic, just moments that gradually pull one life apart from another until the edges of shared existence begin to fray. Recognition is quiet, but sharp. I began to write letters to myself, not to send, not to confront, but to understand. I chronicled gestures, expressions, subtle inflections in his tone. I wrote what I felt, what I saw, what I remembered. It helped me map the slow unraveling. Each note carried a weight. Each observation brought clarity. I realized that this was not about him alone, nor about Vanessa. It was about the space that had quietly been ceded, the intimacy that had shifted without permission. I thought about my own dignity. I had built it over decades, quietly, without spectacle. It was mine to protect, and protecting it required calm, not confrontation. Observation, restraint, and patience became my tools. The following week, I noticed Raymond checking his phone with a careful attentiveness I had not seen in years. He smiled briefly, glanced away, and tucked it back into his pocket. Small things, invisible to the untrained eye, carried immense meaning. I reflected on how much of life unfolds in subtlety. Betrayal, affection, preference, they rarely arrive with announcement.
They move quietly, in gestures, in silences, in the spaces left unfilled by words. I understood that now. I began tending the garden more often. The roses needed pruning. The soil needed turning. I worked with my hands, feeling the dirt, feeling grounded. The house might have shifted, but the earth beneath my fingers remained steady. One afternoon, Raymond returned earlier than expected. He and Vanessa had finished quickly, he said. I noticed he lingered near the hallway, speaking with her briefly before she left. The brief exchange held warmth I once expected to receive from him alone. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, listening to the fading sounds of the day. I realized then that patience had shown me more truth than confrontation ever could. And truth, when received quietly, allows one to make choices with clarity and dignity. I understood that the moments that hurt most are often the ordinary ones, the small gestures, the quiet smiles, the time spent in someone else's presence that once belonged to you. Pain, understated, carries its own authority.
The next visit was different. Vanessa seemed more assured in her movement, more familiar with the routines of our home. She poured tea without asking, set the table with practiced hands, as if she had done this many times before. Raymond introduced her casually to a neighbor who dropped by unexpectedly. I noticed the ease in his voice, the natural way he included her in our life without hesitation. A woman watches these subtleties, and they speak louder than any confession. I continued to occupy the kitchen, quietly attending to pots and pans. I could hear their voices in the dining room, calm, ordinary, and yet the ordinary carried weight, a slow accumulation of intimacy I had not been invited to share. I remembered my mother's words about respect and dignity. A woman does not need to shout to make herself heard, she had said. I felt her voice guiding me as I navigated this slow, unsettling shift. Raymond lingered over papers with Vanessa. I noticed the way he tilted his head toward her when listening, the small nods of agreement that had once been reserved for me. The rhythm between them was easy, unspoken, deeply familiar. I did not ask questions. I did not intrude. I had learned that some things reveal themselves fully only when allowed to. Observation becomes the clearest lens. It shows the truth without distortion. I considered the weight of years spent together, 37 of them. We had built routines, habits, a shared life that now seemed partly claimed by another presence. The realization was not explosive. It was inevitable. I thought about my son. He would notice the change if he visited, the subtle displacement of attention and affection. I resolved to protect him from details he did not need, just as I had protected my own heart in silence. Vanessa left her folder behind again. Raymond told me he would take it back. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, noting the faint scent she carried. It was a quiet intrusion, a marker of belonging that was not mine to share. That night I brewed coffee and sat by the window, reflecting on the day. The house was quiet. I allowed myself to name the shift without accusation. Recognition does not require drama. It only requires honesty with oneself. I noticed how easily Raymond adjusted his schedule to accommodate her. Subtle, careful, and efficient. The pattern was undeniable. I catalogued it in my mind, not to punish, but to understand. Observation has its own clarity. I recalled the early laughter we shared, the lightness that once filled our kitchen. That laughter was not gone, but it had moved, relocated subtly,
leaving a hollow echo in its place. Recognition of loss is often quiet but sharp. I spent the evening at the piano, pressing keys I had not touched in years. Music has a way of aligning the spirit. I played slowly, deliberately, each note a reminder that I still belonged to myself, to my history, to my dignity. I realized that my choice was not whether to feel betrayal. That feeling was inevitable. My choice was how to respond. Calmly, with clarity, with boundaries that preserved the self I had cultivated for decades. The evening ended with the house breathing quietly around me. I knew the pattern would continue, and that my strength would be measured not by confrontation, but by the quiet holding of my own truth.
I began to see the house differently. Each room held echoes of decades spent together. Yet now some of those echoes carried a shadow, not of anger or confrontation, but of displacement. It was subtle, a gentle weight pressing against the familiar shapes I had long considered mine. I spent mornings in the living room, tracing the lines of the sofa, the armchair he once always claimed. I remembered the quiet comfort of shared space, the rhythm of evenings spent in conversation and light laughter. Now that rhythm belonged partly elsewhere. Raymond spoke of her more often, casually, without realizing how much his words weighed on me. Not in accusation, not in boast, but in the ease of familiarity. I had once been the sole witness to his attentiveness. That attentiveness had been quietly shared. I started walking the halls slowly, touching the frames of photos, feeling the texture of curtains, inhaling the familiar scents. I reminded myself that history could not be erased. What had been built remained mine, even as present moments shifted around me. I noticed that he lingered on his phone, checking messages from her at odd hours. The gestures were brief, polite, almost invisible, but I recognized the pattern. Attention directed differently, care dispensed elsewhere. Observation, after all, is never passive. I reflected on the years of our marriage, how patience had carried us through financial strain, illness, and loss, how quiet gestures, coffee made just right, a hand held lightly, had been the glue of decades, and how those gestures once reserved now extended beyond me. I recalled the first time he had introduced Vanessa, calling her a friend. That word had felt harmless at first. Now, with weeks of observation, I understood how words can veil intent. Friend, such a small word for a relationship that had grown quietly intimate. I tended the garden that week, letting the dirt anchor me. Hands in soil, fingers tracing roots, I reminded myself of the grounding that belongs to labor and memory. The house could shift around me, but the earth beneath my hands remained steady. One evening, I heard him laugh softly on the phone. It was the same warmth he had once offered only to me. The sound carried through the hallway, and I paused in the kitchen. I did not move closer. I simply listened, witnessing without intrusion. I began to write again, cataloging small interactions, noting the cadence of his voice, the rhythm of gestures. I did not write to accuse. I wrote to understand, to make sense of shifts that were quiet, gradual, undeniable. Writing made the subtle tangible. I realized that grief can exist without dramatic moments. It accumulates in observation, in quiet recognition, in the slow fading of gestures once claimed.
And yet, grief is not weakness. It is awareness, measured and enduring. One night, Raymond returned from an event later than usual. The house was dark. I had not waited up, but I noticed his key turning in the lock. He moved softly through the hallway, speaking briefly with me about the dinner I had prepared. Polite, detached. I reflected on the ease with which intimacy can migrate, not violently, not with fireworks, but in gestures, in small attentions, in the gentle rhythm of time spent together. It does not always announce itself, yet its presence is clear to the patient observer. I brewed tea and sat by the window. The air smelled faintly of rain, cool and clean. I let myself acknowledge what had been quietly unfolding for weeks. Observation gave me truth, and truth, when recognized calmly, offers clarity for the next step. I understood then that my response would not be public, it would not be dramatic, it would be quiet, deliberate, and self-respecting. That is the measure of strength I had cultivated over decades of living, loving, and enduring. I allowed myself a small smile that evening, not at him, not at her, but at myself. I was still present. I was still whole. My dignity had not been taken. My clarity had been gained, and I had begun to reclaim the quiet center of my life. The next morning, I rose before sunrise. The house was still, except for the faint hum of a neighbor's distant car. I brewed coffee, settled into my chair by the window, and let the quiet settle over me. Observation was easier in the stillness of dawn. I reflected on the years spent cultivating patience, how it had carried me through illness, disagreements, disappointments, how it had taught me that strength is measured not in confrontation, but in calm endurance. I felt that strength now, firm in my chest. Raymond mentioned Vanessa casually during breakfast, not in excitement, not in secrecy, just a passing reference. I responded with the same calm, measured tone I had cultivated. My attention remained steady on my own cup of coffee. I realized that I had become a careful observer, cataloging not to accuse, but to understand. Each gesture, each phrase, each small laugh told me more than a single confrontation ever could. The story unfolded quietly, in layers, without spectacle. I began sorting through old photographs that morning. Images of family vacations, birthdays, quiet evenings at home. I touched each one gently, remembering the life we had built. Nothing there had been erased. Memory does not vanish because present attention shifts elsewhere. I thought about how easily comfort can migrate between people, not violently, not loudly, just quietly, gently, imperceptibly, and how a patient heart notices, observes, learns the truth without need in confrontation. I noticed Raymond's absence more acutely now, not in loneliness, but in awareness. His time, his attention, and the ease in his interactions with her were patterns that could not be ignored. Recognition of them required calm, not anger. I returned to the garden, tending roses and herbs. My hands in the soil grounded me in reality, in rhythm, in the constancy of effort. While the house and heart shifted, the earth beneath my hands remained steady and patient, much like I hoped to be. One afternoon, Vanessa called to discuss a scheduling change. I listened as Raymond responded, polite and accommodating. I did not interrupt. I did not comment. I simply observed, taking note of how easily attention could be divided. Later that day, I walked through the rooms of the house. Light fell through the windows, brushing furniture and floors in soft patterns. I touched the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, acknowledging what had been mine all along. I remembered the early years, the laughter, the small gestures, the quiet love that had been our rhythm. That rhythm had shifted, yes, but the memory of it and my capacity to feel it remained intact. I began cataloging subtle changes in Raymond's schedule and expressions, small attentions, gestures of ease, moments of quiet admiration. I did not document to prove anything. I documented to understand the shape of a shifting pattern. I thought about grief and loss, how they can arrive without spectacle, as quiet recognition rather than violent confrontation. I allowed myself to feel the ache without dramatizing it. Observation was my solace and my guide. The evening settled with a deep, quiet calm. I sipped tea by the window, feeling the house breathe around me. The shift in attention was undeniable, but I had learned the power of patience, the authority of quiet awareness, and the dignity of measured response.
I began noticing the little things that had once gone unnoticed. A soft laugh, a gentle glance, a slight bend in the shoulders when speaking with her. Each subtle gesture added weight to the quiet story that was unfolding in plain sight. Observation had become my work, deliberate and patient. Raymond left early one morning for a committee meeting. He had insisted I stay home, saying it would be easier that way. I did not ask why. I had learned that ease can mask intention and that a careful observer notices more than a curious question ever could. I moved through the house with quiet purpose, dusted shelves, arranged cushions, brewed coffee with deliberate care. My attention was on ordinary tasks, yet every movement reminded me of my own presence. I had not been displaced entirely. The house still belonged to me. Vanessa arrived shortly after, carrying a folder of documents. Raymond met her at the door, his smile easy, casual, familiar. I remained in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly, letting the sounds of their conversation filter through. The ordinary now carried its own weight. They worked together at the dining table. Their conversation was steady, professional, yet there was an intimacy in the rhythm between them. Words left unsaid held meaning. A woman notices these things over years of shared life, and I noticed every subtle shift. I remembered the early years of my marriage, how we built routines, rituals, quiet assurances. Now those same rituals existed around another presence, not loud, not dramatic, just quietly led into the life I had long considered singular. I began writing again, cataloging observations. Small gestures, soft laughter, brief touches on the forearm, attention given elsewhere. I wrote not to accuse, not to shame, but to clarify my own understanding. Observation requires honesty, patience, and careful recording. That night I brewed tea and sat by the window. The house breathed around me. The trees outside swayed in the soft evening breeze. I allowed myself to recognize the subtle shift, not in anger, not in judgment, but in clear acknowledgement of reality. I reflected on dignity, how it is not defined by the actions of others, but by one's own choice to remain whole, even when circumstances change unexpectedly. I resolved to carry myself with quiet authority, no matter how the familiar shifted.
I began preparing meals with greater care, arranging the table for one as if it were a ceremony of patience. I reminded myself that presence is not always shared and that one can honor themselves even when attention is directed elsewhere. I noticed Raymond's voice on the phone, the soft tone reserved for her. I did not linger, did not intrude. I simply observed, catalogued, and allowed recognition to settle in my chest. Patience, I realized, is as much about endurance as clarity. I walked through the house in the early morning light, noting details, the quilt on the bed, the chairs arranged just so, the photographs on the walls. The memory of shared life remained intact, even as present attention shifted toward another. I recalled my mother's words about resilience, how a woman must remain anchored in herself even when circumstances change beyond her control. Those words felt alive now, a guiding force in quiet reckoning. Later that evening, I poured a glass of tea and listened to the house breathe. The pattern was undeniable. Attention had shifted. Intimacy had migrated subtly. But I remained whole, present, and clear in my understanding of the life I had built. I allowed myself a small, deliberate smile, not at Raymond, not at Vanessa, but at the clarity I had gained. The strength of patience, the authority of observation, and the preservation of dignity had become my own quiet victory. The days moved steadily. Vanessa's presence became part of the rhythm of ordinary life, seamlessly integrated into meetings, events, and social circles. The house itself seemed to accommodate her familiarity, the walls remembering her steps as readily as they remembered mine. Raymond mentioned her casually at breakfast, not in boasting, not in apology, simply as a matter of fact, with ease. I acknowledged her presence in my own mind, quietly cataloging the change without comment, without challenge. Observation had become my most reliable tool. I noticed small shifts in his behavior, a softened tone, a careful glance, an unguarded laugh. Not dramatic, not loud, just subtle enough to reveal intention without announcement. A woman who has watched decades of life together knows these cues intimately. I moved through the house, performing small tasks with deliberate care, dusting shelves, arranging cushions, checking the stove. Each act grounded me in presence, reminding me that my life, my home, my dignity remained intact even as attention shifted elsewhere. Vanessa arrived one afternoon, smiling, carrying documents neatly organized. Raymond greeted her with quiet warmth, guiding her to the dining table. I observed from the kitchen doorway, noting the ease of their interaction. Comfort had quietly migrated, and recognition of it pressed gently against my chest. I thought about the early years of marriage, the rhythm we had built together, the laughter, the shared responsibilities. That rhythm existed still, but it was interwoven with a new presence, a subtle shift that demanded recognition and patience rather than confrontation. I wrote again that evening, notes, observations, subtle patterns, gestures, glances, laughter, attention given elsewhere, not to accuse, not to confront, but to understand. Clarity comes through patient observation, as water eventually wears stone. I reflected on dignity. It is not about control or revenge or dramatic display. It is about understanding what is yours to hold, what is yours to protect. My dignity remained intact, anchored in the years of life and love I had cultivated. I walked in the garden, feeling the earth beneath my hands. The roses needed pruning, the herbs needed care. Each act was a reminder that while some things shift beyond our control, the present moment, handled with intention, remains steady and resilient. That evening, Raymond returned from a long meeting. I greeted him calmly, without remark. The house held a quiet order, a stability I had created for myself, separate from the shifting attentions of others. Calm endurance had become my quiet strength. I recalled the soft laughter we once shared, the way he listened when I spoke, the gentle rhythm of long years together. That memory remained vivid, anchoring me even as present attention had subtly migrated to someone else. Observation had become my solace. I catalogued moments in my mind, gestures, tone, rhythm, presence. It revealed patterns, and patterns revealed truth. Truth, recognized calmly, carries its own authority and allows for deliberate choice. I realized patience had its own power. It clarifies, strengthens, and preserves. It does not demand spectacle, does not force confrontation. It allows one to navigate shifts with integrity and dignity without surrendering self-respect. That night I sipped tea by the window. The house was quiet, the air still. I allowed myself to acknowledge the subtle migration of attention, the ease with which intimacy had been shared elsewhere, and I remained whole, patient, and aware. I understood that recognition does not weaken, it strengthens. It allows a woman to measure her own presence, her own worth, and her own dignity. And in that measurement, clarity emerges, steady and unshakable.
The following morning I rose before dawn. The house was still, except for the soft hum of distant traffic. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, letting the quiet settle around me. Observation had become my companion. I watched, I listened, I catalogued the small shifts in the rhythm of my home. Raymond mentioned Vanessa again over breakfast, not in urgency, not in excitement, simply as if stating a fact. I responded calmly, my words measured and deliberate. The ease with which he spoke of her reminded me of how subtle influence can quietly shape a household. I moved through the rooms, touching the familiar surfaces, running my hands over the quilt on the bed, the edge of the dining table. I reminded myself that my history, my memory, my years of careful tending remained intact. The present had shifted, but my presence did not diminish. Vanessa arrived shortly after, carrying a folder of event plans. Raymond greeted her with quiet warmth, guiding her to the dining room. I remained in the kitchen, observing. They spoke in soft, ordinary tones, the intimacy subtle, yet undeniable. A patient woman notices these things immediately. I remembered the laughter we shared in years past, the quiet evenings with shared tasks, the rhythm we had built. That rhythm had been supplemented, not erased. The addition was gentle, subtle, yet its presence carried weight. Recognition does not require drama. It arrives quietly and with inevitability. I began writing again. Notes, observations, gestures, small attentions, laughter, the migration of care. I wrote not to confront, but to clarify my own understanding. Writing allows a woman to order reality, to see the patterns before making deliberate choices. That afternoon, I spent time in the garden, feeling the earth beneath my hands, pruning the roses, tending the herbs.
The act of care grounded me. While attention may shift, labor rooted in purpose remained steady. My hands reminded me that my presence mattered, regardless of subtle changes around me. Raymond returned later than usual that evening. I greeted him with calm, deliberate attention. The house was steady, quiet, organized. I realized that my own calm, my observation, and my grounded presence carried a quiet authority. I needed no confrontation to assert the truth I now understood. I recalled my mother's voice, reminding me that dignity cannot be taken. It is sustained by patience, clarity, and awareness. That lesson had never felt so tangible. Observation, patience, and quiet recognition preserved what I had cultivated across decades of living, loving, and enduring. I began noticing subtle cues in their interactions, how he listened, the tilt of his head, the soft gestures of attention, not dramatic, not loud, but intimate, unmistakable to a woman who has observed life and love over decades. Recognition is the quiet, unshakable authority of truth. I allowed myself to feel the ache of quiet displacement, not the agony of drama, but the slow, gentle weight of shifting attention. I recognized that grief is subtle, often hidden in observation rather than confrontation, and I honored it without allowing it to define me. I thought about my son, how he might perceive the subtle shifts, how he might learn patience from my example. I resolved to maintain dignity, to protect him from unnecessary turbulence, and to demonstrate that a woman can remain grounded amidst changes she cannot control. Later that evening, I brewed tea and sat by the window. The house was quiet, the sky darkened. I allowed myself a calm acknowledgement. Attention may have shifted, intimacy may have migrated, but my presence, history, and dignity remained intact. Observation had preserved them. I reflected on the measure of patience. It is quiet, steady, and unassuming. It allows one to see clearly, to feel clearly, and to act deliberately. I had learned that strength often resides in stillness, not in spectacle, and that clarity comes from careful attention to ordinary truths. By the end of the night, I felt a calm certainty. I had seen the pattern, understood the migration of attention, and recognized my own boundaries. Quiet observation, patient reflection, and deliberate understanding had given me clarity and preserved my dignity. I was ready for the next chapter of my life. The next morning, the house was calm, filled only with the soft hum of routine. I moved slowly, deliberately, feeling the familiar textures of furniture, the quilted warmth of the chairs, the steady weight of years lived here. The air carried a subtle shift, but I remained grounded in presence, aware and unhurried. Raymond mentioned Vanessa over breakfast as though stating a fact. I responded quietly, my tone measured. Observation had become my tool. I catalogued each gesture, each nuance, each subtle inflection. Patterns emerge in small, ordinary actions, and they reveal more than words ever could. I walked through the dining room, touching surfaces I had long tended, the table, the chairs, the corners polished with care. I reminded myself that my history was intact. The shift of present attention did not erase the decades I had built in quiet, steady presence. Vanessa arrived that afternoon, carrying papers and plans. Raymond guided her to the dining room, her steps confident, familiar. I remained in the kitchen, noting the quiet rhythm of their interaction. Ease can migrate subtly, gently, yet the attentive observer notices every imperceptible shift. I remembered the laughter we shared in the early years, the small gestures that defined our intimacy. That intimacy now existed in a different rhythm, quietly intertwined with another. Recognition does not require drama. It comes gently, and its weight is undeniable to the patient heart. I began writing in my journal again, recording observations, gestures, and small attentions. I wrote not to accuse, but to understand. A deliberate mind sees patterns. Patterns reveal truth. Truth allows choice, and choice preserves dignity. Observation had become my steady anchor in shifting currents. In the evening, I tended the garden. My hands moved through soil and stems with steady care. Labor grounded me, reminded me that presence remains powerful even when attention has shifted. While intimacy migrated elsewhere, my life, my actions, and my self-respect were mine to steward. Raymond returned later than usual, his steps quiet on the floor. I greeted him calmly. The house was organized, steady, deliberate. My calm had authority. Observation and presence had preserved my dignity more than any confrontation ever could. I did not need to assert anything loudly. I reflected on my mother's teachings that a woman's strength lies in patience, clarity, and quiet endurance. Those lessons were vivid now, fully realized. Observation, patience, and deliberate recognition had shown me the truth without drama and preserved the authority of my own life. I noticed the subtle cues of attention, the tilt of his head, the softness of tone, the gentle nods of agreement. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. I cataloged them carefully, allowing recognition to shape my understanding without haste or distraction. I allowed myself to feel the quiet ache of displacement, not a screaming grief, not dramatic loss, but the gentle weight of intimacy slowly migrating elsewhere. I acknowledged it, held it, and let it settle without surrendering self-respect or dignity. I thought about my son and how he might learn patience and strength from observing measured response. I resolved to maintain calm and integrity, showing that a woman can remain grounded even as attention shifts beyond her. Presence is not diminished by the migration of another. I brewed tea and sat by the window, letting the house breathe around me. Observation had revealed the pattern, recognition had clarified the truth, and patience had preserved my dignity. I allowed myself to accept the quiet shift, knowing my presence remained firm, anchored in years of life lived fully. I reflected on the power of patience, quiet, steady, deliberate. Strength often resides in stillness. Clarity emerges from careful observation. Recognition preserves dignity. These lessons, learned over decades, had crystallized now, guiding me through subtle betrayal without compromise to self. By the end of the night, I felt calm certainty. I had seen the pattern, understood the migration of attention, and recognized my boundaries. Observation, patience, and quiet reflection had given me clarity. I was ready to close this chapter of quiet reckoning, holding my dignity intact.
Morning light poured into the kitchen. The house remained still, settled in its rhythm. I brewed coffee slowly, allowing the warmth to center me. Observation had become instinct, patience a second skin. I acknowledged the subtle shift, but my presence, my dignity, my history remained firm, unshaken by the quiet migration of attention.
Raymond mentioned Vanessa casually at breakfast, as if stating a simple fact. I responded with calm clarity, neither resentful nor dismissive. Recognition, not reaction, had become my measure. Subtle patterns, gestures, and the rhythm of ordinary life revealed truths more accurately than any argument ever could. I moved through the house deliberately, touching surfaces, running my hands over familiar textures. The quilt on the bed, the polished table, the chairs arranged just so. My presence remained grounded in decades of care, and no subtle shift could undo that history or the strength I drew from it. Vanessa arrived with her folder, steps confident, voice soft and practiced. Raymond guided her to the dining room. I observed silently, noting each small gesture, every inflection of tone. The ease between them was unmistakable, yet it did not diminish my ability to recognize and preserve my own boundaries. I remembered the early years, the laughter, the quiet rhythms, the shared labor of love. That intimacy now existed differently, quietly shared with another. Recognition is subtle. It arrives gently, carries weight, and allows for deliberate, patient understanding. Observation preserves dignity in ways confrontation never can. I wrote again, cataloging gestures, small attentions, and subtle shifts. I did not write to accuse. I wrote to clarify, to understand, and to preserve the integrity of my own presence. Observation is not passive. It is preparation, clarity, and power concentrated in quiet awareness. In the afternoon, I walked in the garden, my hands dug into the soil, tending roses and herbs. Labor grounded me, reminding me that presence and care belong to me alone, regardless of the migration of attention elsewhere. The earth is steady, patient, and it teaches the same lesson. That evening Raymond returned. I greeted him calmly, without demand or accusation. The house retained its order, quiet authority, and rhythm. My presence had not diminished. Observation and patience had preserved my dignity, and I understood the depth of strength that comes from measured endurance. I allowed myself to reflect on my mother's lessons, patience, clarity, dignity, and awareness. Strength resides in quiet presence. Recognition of shifting attention allows deliberate choices. Observation, patience, and self-respect carry authority unmatched by confrontation or spectacle. I had learned these lessons fully in the past weeks. I noticed subtle cues again, tone, gestures, attentiveness, not dramatic, not loud, intimate, undeniable. I cataloged them with care, allowing recognition to shape understanding. Observation allows one to measure truth without forcing conflict, and clarity emerges through patience rather than noise. I allowed myself to feel the quiet ache of displacement, not dramatic grief, not explosive anger, but subtle recognition of intimacy migrating elsewhere. I held it, acknowledged it, and let it settle. My dignity remained intact, my clarity unwavering. Presence and self-respect cannot be stolen quietly. I thought about my son and the lessons he might glean, that strength resides in patience, that recognition carries clarity, that dignity cannot be surrendered quietly, even as attention shifts. My calm, my presence, and my history became a living lesson in measured authority. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and watched the house breathe. Observation revealed patterns, recognition clarified truth, patience preserved dignity. I acknowledged the quiet shift fully, but I remained whole, grounded and calm. I had seen the migration, understood it, and preserved myself through deliberate endurance. I reflected on patience as power, quiet, deliberate, steady. Strength resides in observation. Clarity emerges from measured awareness. Recognition preserves dignity. These lessons, earned over decades, crystallized fully now. They guided me through subtle betrayal with integrity, leaving me intact, aware, and resilient. By nightfall, I felt absolute certainty. The pattern had been seen, the truth understood, boundaries recognized. Observation, patience, and deliberate reflection had given me clarity and preserved my dignity. The house, the life, the love, and my presence all remained intact, and I could finally breathe. I sipped the last of my key and let the quiet settle. The shift was real, subtle, undeniable, but so was my strength. Life continued, history remained, presence endured, and in that calm, deliberate recognition, I found a truth that would linger long after the story had ended.